I want to ask you this morning, what is the most important meal you've ever eaten? The most important meal, and what I mean by that is the event surrounding the meal. I can still remember to this day the very first time I met my in-laws. Well, they weren't my in-laws at the time. They were Sherry's parents. And we were at Moody down in Chicago, and we drove out to Bartlett to meet her family for the very first time. I had met her sister before, but I never met her parents. And we went to the Chili's on Route 64 by the mall over there. I still get like post-traumatic stress disorder when I walk into that Chili's. Because I was a nervous wreck, because I wanted to make a good impression. I was curious what kind of questions they were going to ask me. I was curious what they were going to think about me and what I was going to think about them, and if I had broccoli in my teeth or if I spit something when they asked me a question. Like, all these things are running through my life. And then fast forward to another important meal in my life when I took Sherry out to dinner, and later that evening at a fondue restaurant in Chicago called Gihas. And later that evening, got down on one knee and proposed and asked if she would spend the rest of her life with me. And this incredibly important meal, and you know what I'm talking about, whether it's like a job interview that you know sort of they say, hey, let's go out and grab dinner. This is significant. There's something happening here. Or the celebrations that we have in our lives, birthdays and anniversaries and accomplishments, graduations, we gather together around the table. And even moments just as a church, when we're trying to build community together. When we do that like a few times a year, we clear this room out after the second service and we set up tables. We eat together. Because it's relational and there's connection, there's something significant about it. When we want to meet our neighbors, we fill our parking lot with food trucks and say, hey, come hang out with us and eat with us, be a part of what's happening here. We know the significance of a shared meal. And we know that oftentimes they mark major moments in our lives. A couple weeks ago, we began a teaching series in our fall teaching series entitled With Jesus, where we're asking ourselves, what does it look like for you and I to live as an apprentice of Jesus? So 2,000 years after he walked here on earth, what does it look like for you and I to call ourselves a follower of Jesus? And a couple weeks ago, we looked at Jesus' description, his rather honest and I would say difficult description of the implications of following him. This is what Jesus said to the crowds who had gathered around him and what he talked about when he said what it means to be his disciple. He's on his way to Jerusalem when he says this, where he knows his purpose in going there is going to be to lay down his life. And this is what he says. This is Luke 14, verse 26. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, such a person cannot be my disciple. And we wrestled with this passage because Jesus' words seem so harsh and unattainable. And we realized that Jesus isn't talking about emotional hatred for people that he's already told us to love, but he's rather saying, if you are going to follow me, if you are going to be with me, then I have to be your first priority. In order to be with me, I have to be your highest devotion. He's making the distinction between those who are surrounding Jesus, those who are in the crowd, and what it means to be with Jesus. So over the course of the next several weeks together, we're going to look at examples throughout the Gospels where Jesus is with a variety of different people that are in his presence. And we're going to consider the implications of these journeys, of their experience, as we consider what that means in our journey to live as an apprentice of Jesus. And as you might have guessed, many of these initial interactions, these initial encounters happen at a table. They happen in a home where Jesus enters into their presence. We've already talked about this morning how important a meal can be in our own culture, how significant that can be. And yet in the culture that Jesus lived in, the culture of the New Testament, a meal held so much more significance than even it does in our own culture, in our own minds. In the ancient world, particularly in Eastern cultures, table fellowship was was an incredibly important part of life. In fact, there was a rabbinic saying in the Mishnah, which is like a commentary on the Old Testament, on the Torah, that rabbis used to say that only the marriage bed was more sacred in the home than the family table. So that's pretty important in their life and culture. The evening meal was the center of family life. In Jewish culture, to eat some with someone was to be at peace with them. It was an indication of your acceptance of them, your participation in a shared life. So a shared meal around the table had deep connections and meaning and significance around the whole idea of hospitality. Jesus believed that, Jewish families believed that in entertaining strangers, they might be entertaining angels or entertaining God himself, as we see in Genesis chapter 18 with Abraham. However, because this was such a sacred space, because it was so important in their culture, the Jews were supposed to be careful with whom they shared a meal. There were rules around this. So if you were going to share a meal with someone, you were communicating something. This was significant. You sent a message that wasn't to be taken lightly. And then Jesus enters the picture, who could be constantly found eating with, sharing meals with people who were considered outsiders and outcasts. People who were not welcome around the table of the religious leaders in their culture. People like tax collectors and prostitutes. People, as one translation put it, were called notorious sinners. See, the common criticism of Jesus by the Pharisees and by the religious leaders of the day is that he would share a meal with people who were considered unworthy. This constantly was causing disruption in their community. So the point is that in our own culture, a meal is significant, but in the culture that we're reading into, meals were far more important. A shared meal with someone was communicating something that I accept you, that you are a part of my tribe, that you have value, and there's a relationship here. So throughout this series, I want us to kind of keep a few questions at the forefront of our minds as we process this. First is the question, what do we learn at the table with Jesus? What is this modeling for us? Second, what does it mean for you and I to sit at his table? What is the invitation of the table? And then thirdly, how can we invite others to the table? How do we include others in that? I want to turn to Luke chapter 19. So this is just a few chapters after what we were talking about a couple weeks ago. And we're going to start with a familiar story that many of you may have heard. If you grew up in the church, it's going to even generate a little Sunday school song for you. It's the story of Zacchaeus, who was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, right? So much so that he had to climb up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see, right? We all know that rhyme. But because of that, the familiarity with that, sometimes we read this passage, and it almost, the significance of what takes place here can sort of blow right past me sometimes. So let's look at this with a fresh set of eyes this morning. This is Luke 19, the first 10 verses. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he's gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. What does Jesus encounter with Zacchaeus, this tax collector from Jericho, teach us about the table that he invites us into his home, and how does that shape our understanding of and our need for the salvation that Jesus ultimately offers here? I want to look together at three things. I want to look at the perspective of Jesus in this passage. And then I want to look at the response of Jesus, and then finally the response of Zacchaeus. So let's begin by looking at the perspective of Jesus. The perspective of Jesus. I don't know if you have ever, I know you have. I know sometimes I say that, and I'm really saying you've had this happen. Where you've ever seen somebody and you sort of make like a leap assumption about them only to have that assumption like completely blown out of the water. I mean, we do that from time to time, right? And this is one of the things I think we love about these talent shows that occasionally are on TV, like The Voice and America's Got Talent and all those sorts of things. Is that every once in a while there'll be somebody who shows up on the scene, and you sort of make this leap assumption about them or what they're going to do, and then they do something completely in the contrary that just sort of blows you away. One such example was a kid by the name of Andrew DeLeon. He wears this goth sort of apparel. That's his style and the way he presents himself. And so when he's coming on the show, you could see just kind of what everybody's assuming about him, how he's going, what he's going to sing or what he's going to do, and the assumptions that they're making. But as he comes up to the microphone, he sort of blows everyone away as he does this. He performs this piece of opera in perfect tone. And you could watch over the crowd the sort of like the shock that was coming on people's face, because we look and we say, we know who this is, we know what they can do, and we have this expectation of that. And when they do something completely to the contrary of that, it reveals sometimes that we don't see everything that's present in a person. We sometimes there's stuff there that shocks us and even takes our breath away. The judges, you could watch them sort of silently and then in their faces responding to this guy's performance because it was so outside of what they expected. So I think one of the most compelling and challenging aspects of what we see unfold in this passage is Jesus' ability to see what everyone else misses. To really understand this, I think we have to first stop and think about what everybody else saw when they looked at Zacchaeus. The passage tells us that he is a tax collector in Jericho. Jericho is one of the major cities in the region. It's an important location, and it's known for its wealth. In fact, Josephus, the Jewish historian, referred to Jericho as a divine region, the fattest in all of Palestine. Jericho, like any region in that, or any city in that region, was under Roman rule. So in order to fund the expanding Roman Empire, there was a heavy tax placed on the people. And so Rome would employ these regional tax collectors in order to collect from the people under their subjugation that which they felt like was required of them in order to help Rome expand its empire. What oftentimes would happen is that these tax collectors then would require more of the people. And they were backed by the Roman military. The Roman military was their muscle. And so if Rome was charging 20%, they would charge 30%, give a cut of it to the military, and then grow incredibly wealthy off the difference. So imagine for a moment, if you can, if this is how we operated today. If I had to go into downtown Batavia to my local IRS agent, and not only did I have to pay my fair share of the taxes, but I also knew that he was adding to that for himself in order to grow incredibly wealthy, and that all of us were doing this on a regular basis, how we might think and feel about that person. Like, we're struggling to make ends meet. We're struggling to provide for our family, and I got to go there every week and hand this guy a check, and I know he's ripping me off. Like, this is how Zacchaeus is viewed in that community. And to make matters worse, Zacchaeus is Jewish. He is somebody who has sold out to Rome. They took advantage, he's taking advantage of his own people for personal gain, and they ultimately would view him as a traitor. On top of that, Zacchaeus is, it says, a chief tax collector. So now he is over other tax collectors in the region. He's at the top of this oppressive pyramid scheme. So all that to say, when the people are looking at Zacchaeus, he's not well liked. He's not somebody that people looked at and had esteem for. He is rich and he is despised. On top of that, it tells us that he's short. And so Jesus is entering into Jericho. And Zacchaeus, like many others, is beginning to hear the rumors. Jesus has got this following that's coming, and there's excitement in the city. And as Zacchaeus is wanting to just get a glimpse, just see who this Jesus is, he recognizes that he's not going to be able to because the crowd is simply too large. And so he climbs up in a tree. Now, if you and I were, again, walking around downtown, whatever, and we looked up and there was a full-grown adult in the tree, we would be like, okay, like that's weird. But in this culture, when Zacchaeus is doing this, you have to understand that this is entirely undignified. This is not, in that cultural mindset, they would look at this and be like, you are acting like a child. You're humiliating yourself, Zacchaeus. Like, this is not something that somebody would do on a normal basis. So here's a guy who is hated by his people because he's rich for taking advantage of them. He's a thief who is humiliating himself in public, and Jesus is surrounded by this crowd who's gathered together to welcome him into Jericho, and he stops and he engages with Zacchaeus. Why? Because Jesus sees something more. I think Jesus sees his need. Jesus sees his need here. Zacchaeus, by all reasonable measures, was not the likely person that Jesus is going to stop and engage with, but he does. Because his determination to see Jesus is a reflection of his desperation. His willingness to do whatever it takes just to get a glimpse, to act like a child, reveals not only his curiosity, but I think the degree of his emptiness. That all of this wealth that he's accumulated for himself, everything that he's put together has left him empty. And Jesus sees it, and he stops and he speaks to Zacchaeus personally. In verse 10, Jesus makes this very profound and overt statement of purpose. He says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." Lost here describes Zacchaeus. It's his condition. It's his need, and Jesus sees it, and he stops and he engages with Zacchaeus. That word lost literally means in the wrong place. See, here's the thing that sometimes I do with the Zacchaeus story, is I can disassociate from it, right? But when we understand what Jesus says he's doing here, when he says, I've come to seek and save the lost, the people that are in the wrong place, spiritually, that can be me. I do that. Spiritually, I need Jesus to do for me what he is doing here for Zacchaeus. This not only reveals our own spiritual condition, but it also shows us something about the appropriate response. Zacchaeus is modeling something here for us. Get to Jesus, whatever it takes. And it also then shapes our engagement with the world around us. So Jesus sees his need, but he also sees his worth. He sees his worth. I don't know. So again, trying to place ourselves in the mindset of the people watching this unfold. If I can take you back to middle school for a minute, but you know those moments when you're out on the playground and you're dividing up teams and the two really cool popular kids are obviously captains. So I was never one of those, but they start going and maybe you get selected on a team and you're kind of wanting, and then maybe somebody out of nowhere, maybe it's like their little brother or something like that. They pick the guy and you're like, no. Why did you pick him? I was usually that guy. I'm trying to make it sound like I was looking at this from the perspective of somebody else. But we would look at that situation and be like, why are you doing that? This is what everybody is thinking right now as Jesus says to Zacchaeus, as he engages with him, as he talks with him. What are you doing, Jesus? Like, why are you picking him? Why are you adding him to your team? This visiting rabbi, Jesus, coming into Jericho, the expectation here is that he is going to be welcomed into the home of the elders, the important people, the valuable people in the community. But Jesus sees his worth. He sees that Zacchaeus has value. He understands that God created him, that he's placed eternal value on him. He understands that Zacchaeus is more than the sum of his decisions and his mistakes. Jesus sees his worth. Jesus sees that Zacchaeus has been made in the image of God, and because of all of this, because the desperation has revealed his need, because of his eternal value, he stops and he looks at Zacchaeus and he responds to him. Again, I think part of what is so compelling for me about this text is it exposes the limited view that I live with so often. And Jerry talked about this last week when he talked about praying, how there are people on God's radar around him that aren't yet on his radar. He says, so give me the eyes to see what you see. This is exactly what I think of when I think of how Jesus interacts with Zacchaeus. Give me the eyes to see what you see. This leads us then to the response of Zacchaeus. The response of Zacchaeus. Awareness outside of action is of little value, right? Think about all the commercials that we see on a regular basis where there's like a little lonely puppy and it's got a sad face, and I'm not making fun of this. Like they're pulling on our heartstrings, right, in order to get us to do something about it. They want us to pick up the phone and make a donation or volunteer or to help save these animals in need. They are increasing awareness so that you and I will try to take an action. Here's what we see in this text is that as Jesus becomes aware of Zacchaeus, now we see the action of Jesus, the response of Jesus. Back in Luke 19, verse 5 and 6. It says, when Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. See, one of the reasons that I love this passage so much, I love to teach this, is that the gospel is so overtly on display. First thing that Jesus does here with Zacchaeus is that he invites Zacchaeus to be with him. He says, come down immediately. And I don't want to overcomplicate this. Jesus is inviting Zacchaeus into relationship. He invites him into his presence. Jesus doesn't keep this safe distance that so often we like to maintain around us, but he sees his needs and he extends an invitation into relationship. Come down, Zacchaeus. Come be here with me. Jesus is fulfilling his mission. He's doing what he came to do, to seek and to save the lost, the people in the wrong place. And then he does something completely extraordinary. He invites himself over. He says, Zacchaeus, I'm going to go to your house. I want to enter in. He could have continued this conversation on neutral ground. He could have invited Zacchaeus to join him in whatever home of some spiritually relevant person in Jericho he would have been invited into, but he doesn't do that. Jesus joins him in his space. And the significance of this can hardly be overstated. In a culture where there is no greater symbol of significance, of acceptance, than to sit down in someone's home to enjoy a meal with them, Jesus says to Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, today I must stay at your house. You see, this is the transformative moment. Zacchaeus is lost and Jesus finds him. Zacchaeus is lost and Jesus saves him. This is the power of the gospel. It invites us back into relationship with Jesus. And not only does it do that, it covers the gap that we can't get past in order to accomplish that. This is why there's such this strong negative reaction from the people that are watching this unfold. What are you doing? This is unacceptable. Zacchaeus is an unacceptable person. He's unworthy. He's desperate. And Jesus says to him, come down, Zacchaeus. Come be with me, and I will go be with you. Because I've made you acceptable. Because in a relationship with me, you're made worthy. Which ultimately leads us to Zacchaeus' response to Jesus. His response to Jesus. Verse 6. It says, so he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. And then down in 8 and 9, it says, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay it back 4 times the amount. 2 things real quickly here that we see in Zacchaeus. We see repentance and we see transformation. Zacchaeus overtly, he says out loud, he confesses and he turns. He says, I'm not going to be that person anymore. There is a leaving behind of who he was, a walking away, and Zacchaeus says it not only to Jesus, but to the whole community watching him. And then there's transformation. He goes from a person who's stealing from his own people in order to satisfy his greed and becomes this just expressively generous person. I'm going to give half of everything I have to the poor. And if I've cheated anyone of anything, I'm going to pay it back 4 times. You see Jesus making him in. And Jesus makes this statement in verse 9, right? He says, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. Jesus is not saying because you've given up half of your money, because he's saying this is the expression of a new man. Zacchaeus is a new person. And because of him, he's saying, look, salvation has come to this house. And he leaves Zacchaeus there in that moment, understanding what he's done for him by sitting down, by being with him in his house. Zacchaeus, you're acceptable. You're a new person. I'll close with this. I recently had a conversation with a neighbor. It was actually the Monday after our stadium service. And I woke up that morning to sirens out in front of my house. And I went downstairs to check what was going on. And as I looked out across the house, a sort of kitty corner to us was on fire. A significant fire. Like the garage was engulfed and there was fire trucks everywhere and police cars and it was crazy. So that afternoon, I came to work and I mentioned to Erin Wise, who runs our Shepherd's Heart ministry that we talk about all the time. I mentioned what's going on, and so she gave me some gift cards that had been provided by all of you. And she said, hey, just give these to the people as just a first step. We can find out what else we can do, but this maybe will help them with something they just need today. So it was like $150 in Meijer gift cards. And I went home after lunch and I saw them out there, so I walked across the street and I handed him the envelope and just said, hey, this is just, it's a small gift, but we want you to have it. If there's anything that you need today or in the next few days, hopefully this will help meet that need. And of course he was grateful, and he looks at the envelope and he just says, oh, Chapel Street Church. And I said, yeah. And he goes, do you know anything about the building out in Mill Creek? I said, I've heard of it, And we talked for a while. He goes, actually, one of my best friends goes out there. I said, really? Who's that? He goes, this guy named Randy. I was like, what? I know Randy. I said, I baptized Randy yesterday at our stadium. I'm getting like amped up at this point, he's like, hey man, you got to know, when Randy talks about what's happened to him, he says that place has changed his life. I was like, man, I would love to take credit for that, but that wasn't us. I was like, that man encountered Jesus. And as he's growing in his faith, he's sitting down with his friend and saying, this place has changed everything for me. I think Randy's story and now Rob's story and the story that continues to go, and it obviously reveals that I still have some work to do as far as neighboring, because it's it shows us what Jesus does. Zacchaeus shows us what Jesus does. Today salvation has come to this house. Zacchaeus, Sterling, come down. Come be with me, because I want to go be with you. Let's pray together and we'll close in worship. Father, thank you for this day. Father, thank you for a familiar story that so often a little tune pops in my head and I can miss the impact of what takes place here. But God, as you remind us again of the nature of your invitation, Lord, I pray that we would respond in faith, that we would respond like Zacchaeus does, in repentance and in transformation. because you've been so good to us. Thank you for stories like Randy's and stories that you're still writing like Rob's. Lord, I pray that you would continue to work there. Lord, thank you that in your presence at your table, we find new life.